We love hops as much as the next person. We think malt is underrated, and we literally cannot live without water. But what if I told you the most important ingredient in beer was the last one to be discovered and is invisible to the naked eye? Well, buckle up, because that's exactly what I'm telling you. Without yeast, there would be no beer. Yeast is, without doubt, the most important ingredient in beer. In fact, speak to a brewer and he might well tell you that he doesn't even make beer. The yeast does. Whether we're talking fresh New England IPA or a massive imperial stout, long conditioned lager or barrel-aged lambic, once the brewer has added the malt, collected the sugary water and boiled it with hops, all he can do is create the best environment for yeast to work in. Brewers have spent millennia working to make life easier for yeast to ferment, culminating in the sealed, cone-bottom temperature-controlled cylinders you see in most breweries. But different yeasts work best under different conditions and produce different flavours, so choosing the right strain is as important as treating it right. Yeast is one of the world's great wonders. Too small to see until in huge concentrations, it's still the driving force behind all fermentations and baking, two processes that led to the civilization of the human race. Even so, we've only known its properties and capabilities for about 150 years. Yeast is everywhere, on fruits and trees, every surface, even the air we breathe. There are millions of strains and they all have different properties when you brew with them. Until yeast was discovered, fermentation was based on observation and superstition. We reused the same barrels and clay pots that tasted best, with no idea why. When Louis Pasteur discovered what yeast did, he opened the door to humans collecting, isolating and propagating strains. The best ones for brewing have been slowly collected and produced in factories for commercial use. We'll get back to the wilder yeasts later, instead starting at one of those factories, Lallemand's to be precise. Lallemand are one of the world's largest yeast producers, and we headed to their main brewing production site in Vienna to meet Tobias, the head of R&D for brewing, and Andy, former Darkstar head brewer and UK technical sales manager, to learn the basics of yeast and its production. So my first question, let's keep it really simple. What is yeast?
Yeast is a single cellular organism that is able to convert sugars and nutrients into alcohol, CO2 and flavors. I think that's the simplest explanation.
And what's its deal? Why is it doing that? Just to grow and take over?
Well, its main deal is, like any organism, is to survive. So basically using nutrients like we do, we eat, and in that effect they're also producing side products like we do as well.
Yeah.
And in their case it's alcohol and flavors.
Okay.
And then obviously reproduction is another thing. So yeast can reproduce sexually like we do. You need two yeasts and they produce spores, and then they have a new yeast, which is not so much of an advantage to us because then every yeast cell would be different, like any humans, yeah. So your kids would be different to you.
Yep.
Or in the case of yeast, most of the time it actually sporylates, so the DNA just get duplicated and you have exactly the same replicate of the yeast. It's always in splits, always the same trait of the yeast, and you have consistent results with your yeast.
And how is that process kick-started by you guys here?
Well, everything starts in Montreal. That's where we have our culture collection, so all the strains that Lallemand owns are stored there. And then they prepare slants, and from there they take a loop and start the first shaking flask culture. That's 125 mils, 1 day. Then they go in the next step, it's 1 liter, and then they go into 9 liters, and these are all the 3 lab steps. And then they go into the plant and start 2 more batch fermentations before they switch then to a fed batch propagation. That's when we really start producing yeast.
From these small beginnings in a test tube, production of the yeast is ramped up fast in giant tanks that look a lot like fermenters. Lallemand's special sugary formula creates biomass but doesn't produce any alcohol, resulting in usable wet yeast. At this point you could pretty much pitch it right into a beer, and many breweries do so either with their own propagated yeast or by buying it in. But a lot of what Lallemand produces is dried yeast, a powdered form that's easier to transport, store and use. That's done in a truly bizarre and magical way, with a Ferris wheel. Yeast is sprayed onto the outside of the wheel and slowly dried, before being spaghettified to increase the surface area and dried even further. The result is a fine yeast sand that's packaged and sent off for use by breweries. Before we head to the brewery though, let's get a bit more insight into the different kinds of yeast. The most common form of brewing yeast is called Saccharomyces. In fact, pretty much every beer you've ever drunk was made with one of the two families within that group. There's the ale yeast, Cerevisiae, and the lager yeast, Pastorianus. The only big difference between the two families is that lager yeast ferments at a lower temperature, so it takes longer and ultimately produces less flavour. Johnny asked the guys at Lallemand where these strains come from and what the differences are from a biological perspective, and he found himself down a rabbit hole.
Well, Cerevisiae is a single strain, basically, because it's so old. It's a huge variety of different strains within the Cerevisiae genus, and the Pastorianus is a hybrid of Cerevisiae and Eubayanus.
It's been isolated from forests.
From forests in Patagonia in Argentina. They found it everywhere in the world now except for Europe, and that's where actually they believe the hybridization happened.
Right.
So, which is a bit strange. So
there's lots of different theories as to how it arrived in Europe.
Pangaea splitting or whatever.
Like, did it go down the old Silk Road? Did it fly from Patagonia?
Patagonia
Just from the awesome bird who started lager brewing in the Munich area of the world.
Probably in the wood because it was isolated from trees, so it might be in a boat or in a barrels or things like that where it kicked over. And this happened relatively recently, and that's why we don't see a huge variety of different strains in the lager.
So the lager yeasts are much younger in terms of their family tree. And so when it comes to brewing, the difference, people talk about top and bottom cropping, talk about different speeds of ester production and stuff like that. What are the sort of the three or five bullet points of the
bullet points, yeah. I mean,
two?
you have top and bottom fermenting. This is in the old open fermenters. So the top fermenting strains, like a typical wheat beer strain, for instance, Bavarian wheat beer, they produce several cells and they stick together. And when you produce gas, the gas traps and lifts them to the top. And so they stay there and you can skim the yeast off. Whereas the lager yeast, they usually build one or two cells and then split and they fall to the bottom.
So now we know the most common varieties of yeast in beer, as well as the fact that yeast creates alcohol and CO2 in beer during fermentation. But how does yeast end up contributing to the flavour of beer? So, when you start using a yeast as a brewer, we know it produces alcohol.
Sure.
It's producing other stuff, and that's where you're getting flavours from, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So what are these other things that it's producing?
So I think the major component is esters. So they're chemicals which have a very fruity character to them. So as it ferments, and depending on the temperature it ferments at, it will start to produce lots of these different esters and give you that kind of fruity character on the beer.
And is there any point to these esters, or is it just like a side thing?
No, I mean, they're produced as part of carbohydrate and amino acid metabolism by the yeast, but they're definitely probably the main kind of flavour component that you get from a fermentation, or one of the main ones. And they're definitely responsible for quite a large proportion of the aroma of a beer. So.
Right, so we'll get into the technical side of the brewing in a moment, but all these different yeast strains that you guys work with, they're producing in different quantities these flavour compounds.
Yes, definitely, and that's all depends on genetics, so the number of enzymes and genes that they produce that are involved with the metabolism of the amino acids and sugars produce varying levels of these esters depending on how many of those enzymes are present.
There are a lot of these compounds, and they present in pretty much all beers, but often at a level undetectable by our palates. Lots of these flavours and aromas are delicious though. There's isomyl acetate, the classic Bavarian banana aroma. There's ethyl acetate, which has that sweet nail polish smell found in big Belgian ales. There's ethyl butyrate, which is mango, pineapple and other tropical fruits, and lots more besides. These bold flavours need to complement and balance the other flavours in the beer, the bread, caramel or toast from the malt, and the citrus and spice from the hop. To find out more, we headed to Northern Monk in Leeds, who used the Lallemand strain we saw being produced and happened to be one of our favourite breweries in the UK. So we've flown from Vienna to the equally gorgeous Leeds to see Northern Monk, who are a customer of Lallemand, and you use their New England yeast, which we saw being made, is that right?
Yep, we do. We use it in a few of our core beers. The New England styles like Faith and Heathen. You get those lovely little peachy esters in there, hints of soft fruit, tropical fruit in it. All accentuates what you're going for. That's the beauty of use of that is you can always use slightly less hops because you know you're getting the flavour profile from the yeast as well as the hops.
Yeah. Everyone talks a lot about sort of the ester profile in New England beers, or the yeast profiles and things like lambics and stuff like that. But different yeasts still have a huge flavour impact on beers, even if we're talking Pilsners or West Coast IPAs, is that right?
Absolutely, like, no matter which yeast strain you're using, there's so many hundreds of compounds involved in the fermentation process that even from lager to lager, where you're looking at a really clean profile, when you're talking about it, yeast didn't really come into it. If you change which lager strain you use to ferment that lager, you're going to get a completely different beer at the end of it. So there's clearly plenty going on in there, even though it's just still subtleties and
sort of the nuances.
Yeah, exactly. A little bit floral there, a little bit of sort of minerality there. What makes a difference.
As you can tell, there's a lot the brewer can do to add complexity to beer with the right yeast. New England IPA is a great example, adding rounded stone fruit sweetness to sharp hop citrus. In Belgian triples, the yeast clove and spice adds to the brioche sweetness of the malt and the high alcohol. In Czech lager, the snap of a clean yeast helps cut through the caramel and floral sours. But even once a strain is chosen, there's more work to be done. Brewers use the yeasts that have the profile they need and look to enhance them through a combination of population, temperature, time and pressure. So how do you, from a technical point of view, obviously you've got all these yeasts and lots of these yeasts like the Lallemand one are being used by hundreds of brewers and they're all getting slight variations out of it. What control does a brewer have over the yeast?
There's temperature. If you ferment it, the one we ferment, the higher the ester profile it's going to present, as a general rule. That can, again, depending on the style of beer, that can also lead to issues where you get more higher level alcohol, so you're more likely to get that boozy character you associate with like a barley wine and so on if you let it go too warm in a high sugar content environment. Pitching rate's quite a big influencer. There's some yeast strains which actually favour being slightly underpitched. It's that slight stress on the yeast, like carefully managed stress on the yeast. That's again brings out that flavour profile.
And what about like in a mash regime? You can bring out certain sugars and certain lengths of sugars that yeast either likes or doesn't like as well.
Yeah, it's another way that we can manage the sugar consumptions with the dryness versus the full body of a beer. A lower mash temperature gives you more fermentable sugars, so more smaller chain sugars in there, and that that's favourable to a bone dry Pilsner or a West Coast IPA. So the higher you go in the mash temperature, the more complex the sugars in there, and therefore you get higher finishing gravity, which means more body, potentially more sweetness. So you're balancing that versus the tenure profiles of the yeast. So if we've got New England's quite a good example. It's got a lovely ester profile, but it's actually quite a high attenuating yeast. So we'll often mash that quite high to try and leave some of that body and stuff behind.
A further way in which brewers can influence the flavours during fermentation is a relatively less understood process called biotransformation. Simply put, this involves the yeast not just breaking down the sugar in the malt, but chemicals in the hops, changing their character and often resulting in a more pronounced, juicier hop aroma. In pursuit of those aromas and flavours, brewers have started dry hopping earlier in fermentation. Combine that process with a yeast that struggles to drop out of suspension, all the oats and wheat currently going into IPAs and other styles, and you have the reason behind all of the hazy beers currently coming out of modern breweries. We've talked a lot about Saccharomyces, but this isn't the only family of brewing yeast. Let's get a little wilder and talk about the funky strain called Brettanomyces. While Brett can be bought from a yeast supplier, it's most famous as the major flavour component in lambic, a beer inoculated not from a packet, but from the air in and around Brussels and the wooden barrels it's fermented in. In such, wild beers adds a funky cider-like character, specifically the farmyard horsey kind of aromas. That's not the limit of what it can do though, and it's used in all kinds of beers like the Trappist beer Orval and several American IPAs. It's even part of some traditional British brewing.
Brettanomyces is a non-Saccharomyces strain, obviously. It's I think it was originally isolated from beers in Britain.
That's where the
British fungus.
That's what I mean. Breton.
Yeah, that's where it came from. But it's found actually in a lot of Belgian beers as well, and produces very typical flavors. It's usually a slow-growing strain, and often it appears later in the stage of fermentation or in barrel aging.
So once the Saccharomyces has run out of steam,
they're quicker.
Brett sneaks up and goes.
And they can actually ferment further than most of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae as well. And they produce quite interesting flavors.
Yeah. Very different esters, so they can use organic acids that might be present in the wort and produce kind of strawberry flavours and all sorts of things.
Because Brett is often found in spontaneous beers, it's usually found in conjunction with other wild bacteria, and that's where things start getting really wild. Enter souring agents Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, and Acetobacter. As these bacteria go to town on the beer, they release acids that lower the pH of the beer, turning it sour. These bacteria can come from the wild or be added by the brewer, working in tandem with the yeasts to change the beer's flavour. The result can be challenging but also hugely complex and rewarding, particularly as the different strains and concentrations of these wild bacteria and yeast add an element of locality or terroir to a beer. Breweries even develop house cultures unique to them, like the Awesome Little Earth project, who use their small cider production to fuel their brewery. So the main reason we're here is that these apples are the origin of your house yeast. So was that just an idea where you're like, well, it'd be nice to have a house culture, I wonder what's on these apples kind of thing?
Yeah, it's kind of both things happened at the same time. So we were looking at starting Little Earth project, and we'd obviously been making this cider for quite a long time before that, and we knew that the cider tasted good and was just naturally fermented, so we do nothing but just press the apples.
Yeah,
and
so you knew there was some
viable,
tasty yeast.
Yeah, viable, tasty yeast. And then we thought, well, you know, it doesn't always come out great, and sometimes it comes out better than others. So we thought, well, if we choose the batches where the cider tastes really good, which is actually one of the things we did yesterday. So one of the barrels in the brewery yesterday, in the main brew room, you might remember it's one stacked on top of two, kind of by the sink. Yeah. That was filled up yesterday with some wort, and yeah, it was a freshly emptied cider barrel. So it was just, we emptied it on Sunday, I think, and then it was filled up again.
So you're not even
Tuesday.
pitching anything, you're just
not even pitching,
relying on what's
in the barrel.
Is that every single batch you do? You do that, or you must be pitching into?
We actually have a couple of barrels in the brewery where we add fresh wort all the time. So we kind of have a almost a Solera that we don't sell. We use as a kind of a yeast propagation culture. Kind of a
right, yeah,
barrels. So again, it's kind of all a bit kind of rustic and a bit hands-on, but it seems to work.
Everything a brewer does is to complement and cater to the yeast they've chosen, so it affects flavour and aroma more than perhaps all the other ingredients. But it also controls the body and sweetness of a beer too. When we talk about yeast, I guess it's important to also talk about how much residual sugar's left, or how wild that fermentation was.
Exactly, yeah. If you're using a yeast strain that does 85% attenuation versus one that does 80 or so on, you are going to be left out with a little bit more residual sweetness, and that's going to affect your profile. So yeah, so the yeast strains that are popular for West Coast styles, there's no coincidence they're highly attenuative too. So they consume high volumes of sugar, they can handle some of the more complex sugars, and that gives you that bone dry character that you're looking for in a West Coast IPA or in a crisp Pilsner. English ales are obviously traditionally very fruity, but they've got that residual sweetness. On all these yeast strains are generically low attenuating yeast, so they're only maybe doing 60 to 70% of the sugars available rather than up towards 80 in something like the SO5 or a White Labs 01 Cali Ale yeast that we use for those styles. And again, like the British ale yeast, they also have very high ester profiles. So you're getting sometimes you sort of berries and cherries, but you're also seeing your more orchard fruits and your peach elements, and sort of lychee kind of thing, and that people look for in these New England IPAs. And the low attenuation, obviously higher sugar profile, you're leaving more mouthfeel. Not always more sweetness, but certainly more mouthfeel behind.
Yeah, more body and
and that
syrupiness.
All helps attenuate what you're looking for in these New England IPAs. Is that really soft, rounded, fluffy, cloudy, like drinking a cloud.
Yeah.
Yes.
With its influence felt throughout the entire brewing and tasting experience, it's no wonder yeast is seeing a lot of research and development recently, and laboratories are constantly innovating to make both the brewer's life easier and to widen their palate. Back at Lallemand, we get a hint of what we can expect in the future. So yeast has been around obviously for as long as humans have. There's, I guess, millions of different strains. Right, because they're single cell, they're very simple, they've been around forever. What kind of research and development are you able to do at Lallemand to, I guess, broaden the horizons of what yeast can do or what brewers can do. So obviously you guys have developed a dry New England strain, which is quite a big thing.
Last year we came out with that one, big success.
Yep.
Has a unique flavor. Also, one of the strengths or characteristics of that strain is it produces an enzyme, excretes an enzyme that can break down hop components that are usually not flavorful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it's a beta-glucosidase, and it breaks down into sugar and this hop compound, so the hop flavor gets more intense. So
right, okay, so you're breaking apart more compounds.
Exactly, that's also coming from the yeast.
Yeah.
And other new things, we're having non-Saccharomyces yeast, we have some hybrids that we tested, and then we work also with bacteria. That's a new thing in Lallemand, that we produce bacteria for sour beer production, which is becoming quite popular in the States and in South America.
We've heard particularly bigger brewers talking about yeasts that maybe mimic hop bitterness and hop flavours as well. Is there sort of, perhaps in the bigger breweries, a move towards being more efficient by getting extra flavours into yeast rather than having to rely on extra ingredients?
You mean like GMOs?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's something, I mean, we just released the yeast in the US. It's genetically engineered yeast that produces lactic acid, so you don't need the bacteria. You basically have one strain that produces alcohol and lactic acid in the same fermentation, just one organism.
Save you, if you're making a kettle sour, save you an extra pitch.
Save you an extra pitch. Obviously, there's all kind of flavors. There's been papers out where they just produce the geranol and linalool. This is from a mint and a basil plant, genes from mint and basil that they implemented in the yeast and get these hop flavors out. You can produce vanilla flavors, raspberry, pretty much anything you can imagine you could do with genetic.
So we're now making pastry yeast.
Pastry yeast.
So next time you crack a beer, have a think about how much of its character might be coming from the choice of yeast. You'll find there isn't one part of beer's structure that isn't influenced by it. Aroma, flavour, sweetness, body, even shelf life. So as drinkers, we can get a much better understanding of beer by knowing the process yeast goes through and the varieties available. Whatever the style, a beer's success all comes down to what that tiny microbe does in secret behind those wooden and stainless walls.